Make sure my own mic's on. Thank you, Aaron, for that lovely introduction. Thank you to the Newberry for having me again. The last time I was here, it's kind of a surreal experience. I was a grad student. It was pre-pandemic. I was taking the South Shore line in from Notre Dame to do my research here as a grad scholar in residence. And so it is great to come full circle and come back and share so much of that work that I've done here in the Newberry and in Chicago and the surrounding region with you all today. So thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure. I'm going to begin today with a kind of an opening anecdote from the Revolutionary era. We don't typically think about Chicago as a key site of Revolutionary America, and yet it was, at least to the people in this region and the wider Great Lakes. So in 1778, an Anishinaabe representative from the Chicago region's indigenous towns approached the Virginians' encampment with the confidence of a man who held all the cards. George Rogers Clark had led a force of Virginia revolutionaries against the British posts in southern Illinois, and Siganok, this indigenous leader, was here to pursue a new alliance with the recent arrivals. In July of 1778, Siganok had made his intentions known by sending a belt of wampum to signal friendly intentions towards the Americans. Clark then followed this up by making, quote, strict inquiries about the Blackbird, which was Siganok's translated name. He learned from local traders that Siganok, quote, had great influence among considerable bands of Anishinaabe along Lake Michigan's southwestern shoreline. Clark went so far as to pay a trader $200 to contact this allegedly powerful Siganok and invite him to Kaskaskia for talks. Clark likely wondered if he had overpaid when Siganok arrived that fall with a retinue of only 8 warriors in tow. But the subsequent meeting went well. Siganok impressed the American commander with his frankness and pragmatism, accomplishing a significant diplomatic coup, given Clark's well-known prejudices against indigenous peoples. Unlike many of the other native leaders Clark had already met with in the Illinois country, Siganok forsook the, quote, usual preparations and ceremonies that remained a staple of borderlands diplomacy. Instead, Siganok got down to what Clark described as the business of consequence that concerned both of our nations. Hailing from the young towns of indigenous migrants around Chicago's portage, Siganok presented himself as a new man of the borderlands, someone who, like Clark, was able to put diplomatic protocols aside and push for pragmatic alliances on behalf of his faction's agenda in the midst of a continental revolution. Clark was impressed, describing the Anishinaabe leader as, quote, a polite gentleman and an inquisitive Indian, and going so far as to mention him by name in dispatches back to Virginia to Patrick Henry and Virginia's congressional delegates. As it was relayed to Patrick Henry, Siganok, or as Clark called him, the Great Blackbird, was a chief worthy of special recognition from the Americans. To such a potent ally, Clark gave Siganok gifts valued at 20 or 30 pounds for himself and his immediate family, as well as several pack horses of goods for his people, meant to secure this alliance and to signal a promise of future correspondence between the Americans and the Chicago native people. Siganok returned home to Chicago successful on all counts. But it was more than just Siganok's demeanor that won over Clark and the Americans. Siganok knew the power of his home geography well, and he impressed its strategic significance on Clark and the revolutionaries, just as he had done to Spanish officials in previous meetings in St. Louis. Siganok understood that his people, though on the very edges of the Anishinaabe homeland of the Great Lakes, sat on one of the most crucial sites in all the continental interior. As Siganok explained to anyone who would listen, friendly relations with his people at Chicago could secure access to Chicago's valuable portage route, an overland connection point between the Mississippi River and the Great Lakes. Over a few miles of low-lying ground, the Chicago Anishinaabe controlled the shortest overland route connecting the major canoe routes and two of the major waterways of the continent. Just as Siganok's Chicago Anishinaabe could open this route to allies and friends, they could harness it as a threateningly exposed flank to the British in the Great Lakes, or as a blockaded route to other enemies. As Siganok offered an alliance with Clark, and as Clark took it, both men understood that this diplomatic calculation was as much about geography as anything else. Chicago's portage and had endowed the local area with tremendous strategic implications for anyone with regional or continental ambitions to power. And by the 1770s, Chicago's Anishinaabe understood this. They capitalized on it and could wield its significance as they navigated the changing geopolitics of the colonial American borderlands. Of course, Siganok would not be the first nor last person to appreciate the significance of Chicago's unique geography. And the Anishinaabe would not be the only group to harness the portage for strategic purposes over the long history of this space. During the era of early contact and colonization, Chicago's network of overland canoe routes grew into a crossroads of interactions as indigenous and European powers vied for its control. Even deep within the interior, then, we see how power relations fluctuated based on the control of these waterways and local environmental knowledge. Pushing beyond political and cultural explanations for indigenous European relations, then, I argue in this book and elsewhere that the history of Chicago's portage offers a new way of understanding the important role waterways and local geography played in indigenous colonial relations more broadly. Ultimately, as I'll showcase today, the history of early Chicago opens up new ways for understanding how the United States gained control of the North American interior through a two-pronged subjugation of both the landscapes and peoples of the continent, as told through the local history of Chicago. Now, to orient ourselves, here's a map of Chicago as it may have looked in the 17th century, based on the scant archival sources and maps that we can access. Chicago sits along a natural continental divide, formed after the last ice age. This low glacial ridge running between a marshland lake and the beginnings of the Chicago River's southern branch kept the Mississippi and St. Lawrence drainages separate by only a thin strip of saturated earth. Wet prairie, comprising much of the terrain in the immediate area, was tending towards seasonal flooding as the impermeable layers of topsoil and prairie grasses became waterlogged from snowmelt every year and spring rains. This was contested ground, as one naturalist has described it, muddying the distinction between water and land, and varying from one rainfall or snowmelt to the next. While times of low precipitation allowed the low-lying prairies to temporarily dry out, seasons of inundation could also flood the entire area, skewing and blurring the lines between even the two major watersheds. A labyrinth of sluggish waterways coursed over the marshy terrain of the wider Chicago area, feeding a rich wetlands ecosystem between the glacial waters of Cold Lake, Michigan, and the tallgrass prairie of the Illinois country proper. Several rivers, of course, ran through this matrix of sloughs, marshes, oak groves, and submerged prairies, providing paths for drainage, but also, crucially to the human history of the region, routes of travel. At least two ancient portages served to connect the waterways of this area, providing short overland pathways that indigenous people could carry canoes and supplies between in order to access the watershed of the Great Lakes to the east or the Mississippi River drainage to the west. One of these carrying routes, called the Portage des Chênes by the French, familiar to us as kind of the marked Chicago portage today, ran from a creek ran overland between the South Branch of the Chicago River and into the Des Plaines, while the other portage, the southern route, Portage de Perches, ran from the creek off the Little Calumet River into another tributary of the Des Plaines. There may have been another northern route based on some oral traditions and archival sources, but archaeological evidence remains scarce for locating that potential avenue. Given the varying water levels between seasons and the intersecting backwaters, the lengths and locations of these portages could change and vary from year to year and even season to season. Yet the fact that multiple portage routes existed through Chicago's swamps, providing travelers with a range of options to carry canoes and supplies over land, made this a crucial piece of real estate in the continental interior. During the 17th century, a wide array of human traffic passed through the portages along these waterborne crossroads. Early in the century, Oneota people, identified by their Huber phase archaeology, exploited the wetland resources along Chicago's riverine routes. But such strategic geography soon attracted newly aggressive groups as well, including Illinois slave traders, Miami farmers, Anishinaabe middlemen, Haudenosaunee or Iroquois war parties, French fur traders, and Jesuit missionaries. These various groups came to envision Chicago's portages as strategically important routes, even while control of the area proved elusive. Chicago's accessibility as a waterborne thoroughfare cut both ways in the 17th century. While the ease of the route made it a thriving conduit for movement and exchange, its openness left any local inhabitants or itinerant travelers vulnerable to invasion and attack along these interior maritime routes. By the end of the 17th century, as Miami-speaking Weas, Catholic missionaries, and French officials began to establish collaborative footholds at the portages, Chicago's role would begin to change. No longer simply an opening for waterborne movement, a diverse group of native peoples and Europeans began to hope for a more permanent presence along the confounding waterways of Chicago's wetland. Examining Chicago then as this transitional space, both environmentally, ecologically, and in human geography, offers a more fully fledged picture of indigenous European relations in the Great Lakes during the 17th century. Much of the ebbs and flows of power remain rooted in particular geographies of encounter. The Chicago portage, or portages, serving as a transition zone between the eastern woodlands and tallgrass prairies and a bridge between waterways of the Great Lakes and the Mississippi drainage, made for a natural conduit of movement both before European contact and after French incursions into the West. As the corridor connecting the region's waterways, and one situated between powerful native peoples, Chicago began the century as an ecological and geographic space in between. But as this diverse array of people became enamored with the potential of the site, Chicago would transform from just a thoroughfare for trade and travel into a borderland of contention and eventually a potential site of settlement. While no one group proved capable of claiming and controlling the Chicago portages during this early era of contact, the route through the wetlands remained a strategically and commercially significant space of movement throughout the period. It was, of course, indigenous geographic knowledge about Chicago's route that first brought the French to the portages. In late 1772, the incoming Governor General of New France, the Comte de Frontenac, commissioned Louis Joliet, a fur trader from Quebec, to explore rumors of a large river to the west, which might, quote, provide a passage to the Pacific Ocean or Sea of China. On December 8, 1672, Joliet arrived at the Jesuit mission of St. Ignace on the north shore of the Straits of Mackinac, where he recruited the Jesuit father, Jacques Marquette, to accompany him on this venture. As the expedition members waited out the winter, they worked to glean geographic knowledge from the native people that had traveled the unknown waters to the south and west of them. Marquette described in his journal how they, quote, obtained all the information we could from native people that traveled the unknown regions. With this information, the French, quote, even traced out from their reports a map of the whole of that new country. On it, we indicated the rivers which we were to navigate, the names of the people and the places through which we were to pass, the course of the great river, and the direction we were to follow when we reached it. End quote. Sketching maps from descriptions provided by local Odawa and other native visitors, Joliet and Marquette constructed a geographic picture of the lands that lay before them and the river routes they hoped to follow that spring. Armed with these native-informed maps, Joliet and Marquette set out in May of 1673 to find a route from the Great Lakes into the Mississippi River, along with 5 voyageurs, French adventurers employed to paddle the canoes. In 2 birch-bark vessels, they made their way to Green Bay, traveled up the Fox River, portaging across to the Wisconsin, and eventually working their way down as far as Arkansas on the Mississippi River. On the return, after ascending as far as the Illinois country, Joliet and Marquette's expedition visited a large village of the Kaskaskia groups of Illinois, where one of the settlement's leaders offered to show the French a route that, quote, greatly shortened our road as they sought to return to Green Bay and Michilimackinac. This Kaskaskian headman and several of his people guided the French party up the Illinois River in September of 1673 and into the tributary that the French would eventually call the Des Plaines River. From the Des Plaines, Marquette recalled, quote, there is only one portage of half a league into the waters of the Chicago River, about 1.5 miles if you want to do rough math. Here, Joliet, Marquette, their 5 voyageurs, carried their canoes with, quote, but little effort, as Marquette puts it, back to the Great Lakes watershed. Crossing the muddy ground of Chicago that separated the Des Plaines and Chicago rivers, Marquette and Joliet found themselves back along the shores of Lake Michigan. The Frenchmen parted with their Illinois guides somewhere along this route and headed north to Green Bay, arriving by late November. None of their discoveries, of course, would have been possible without indigenous hosts and guides along the way. It was native knowledge of the river routes that allowed Joliet and Marquette to reach the Mississippi in the first place, and the Kaskaskia's awareness of the quickest portage back up to the lakes through Chicago, which brought Joliet and Marquette through this region at all. With the successful conclusion of this expedition, Joliet rushed back to Sault Ste. Marie and then Quebec to report his discoveries of the Mississippi to Frontenac. He arrived to make his report to officials in New France during the summer of 1674. He had found the Mississippi, confirming rumors that the French Jesuits and officials had been fielding from native informants for decades. But as significant as that discovery was, Joliet was also eager to highlight the importance of the overland passage his Kaskaskia guides had shown him. The portage at Chicago ran only a short way between the 2 watersheds and lay over very low prairie. Joliet ventured to suggest that the French could dig a small canal here, which would eliminate even the short portage, thus joining the waters of the Great Lakes with the upper reaches of the Illinois and Mississippi drainage. At Chicago, Joliet saw the potential for uniting France's claims across the continent from the Gulf of St. Lawrence in Canada all the way to the Gulf of Mexico, far to the south. Relaying Joliet's ambitions for Chicago, Frontenac wrote to Jean-Baptiste Colbert, France's Minister of State, in November of 1674. Brushing over the details of the expedition finding the Mississippi, he reported significantly on Joliet's, quote, navigation so easy through the beautiful rivers that a person can go from Lake Ontario and Fort Frontenac in a boat to the Gulf of Mexico. Once Frontenac established order in the region, he hoped that New France would be ready to pursue a water route to the Mississippi drainage through Chicago. In the meantime, Frontenac forwarded Joliet's redrawn map, a version of what you see here, on to Versailles. With Joliet's report and Frontenac's endorsement, New France's colonists seemed poised to take control of Chicago's route and thus open up an internal system of waterborne connections that would unite the continent under French power. As Frontenac and Joliet implied to the crown, the only requirement would be the commitment of the French imperial state towards a canal project through Chicago's marshlands. As the 18th century began, French officials and missionaries alike looked to shore up their influence along Chicago's route. Pierre-Charles de Liette spent 4 years living among the We at Chicago as the local representation of France's imperial hopes for the portage at the dawn of this new century. Further afield, officials throughout New France continued to tout the importance of Chicago in their schemes for French empire in the American interior. Antoine de la Mothe Sieur de Cadillac, one of the most outspoken of these champions, wrote extensively about the geographic potential of both the Great Lakes generally and Chicago's portages specifically, offering a reimagining of the visions first echoed by Joliet and later La Salle in earlier decades. All French travelers had to do to unite the continent, according to Cadillac and others, was, quote, make a portage that is to carry baggage, end quote, occasionally between adjacent bodies of water. With the exception of these few short overland junctions, which Cadillac identified as Niagara and Chicago, quote, one can navigate the interior of the country on fresh water in a ship anywhere they want to go. Cadillac believed, of course, Chicago loomed large in these visions. This small patch of ground remained key to French hopes for empire in the interior. Chicago, as a portage that connected navigable waterways, allowed French officials to imagine an empire in the interior, even as they might struggle to make it a reality. European map makers also projected this imagined geography onto spaces like Chicago. This map is an excellent representation of that. Jean-Baptiste Louis Franklin first included a Fort Chicago at the portage in his 1688 map of North America, you see pictured here. While he likely based his maps for it on scant references to fur trading posts or depots built by La Salle and his men in the late 17th century, Franklin embellished the report to show a fully fledged military fortress at Chicago. This is an invented fort by Franklin. But it projected French power at the crucial portages, and it fit within this wider message and style of the map. Along with the fictionalized Fort Chicago, you'll notice Franklin also included images of tall-masted ships, European-style sailing upon the Lake Michigan waters. And while no such ships existed in the Great Lakes at the time, Franklin's map made clear this statement of projected maritime power by the French imperial state. While never realized, the fictionalized Fort Chicago and that elusive French navy demonstrated French designs for this site as a key junction in the region and its broader ambitions to create a freshwater maritime empire in the continental interior. As Cadillac penned his treatises and European cartographers drew their maps, both highlighted the Great Lakes as a burgeoning site of maritime empire. At the time, such predictions seemed well on their way to fruition. De Liette and the Jesuits were making inroads at Chicago in the local area among the Weas, and trade continued to flourish across Chicago's portages after these Miami speakers had settled the area. With continual exchanges between indigenous groups and the expanding French fur trade, canoes and cargoes continued to pour through Chicago. Now, a truer map of the picture of the 18th century in the interior comes to us from the Newberry. This is the De Fer map from 1718, detailing a slight variation on this French maritime vision. Because here you'll see a more realistic picture of how navigation works in the interior. The proliferation of the birch bark canoe in the Great Lakes enhanced the potential for waterborne mobility across Chicago's portage and elsewhere. Northern Algonquian peoples, such as the Wendat, Wabanaki, Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi, had perfected birch bark canoe construction over centuries of riverine travel. These lightweight vessels, which you see several places on this map, including Lake Michigan, and notice the portaging image there too, made carrying boats between waterways practical. These canoes were sturdy enough to transport goods and people across shallow waters and the region's rivers, as well as the wider expanses of the open Great Lakes. They were, in short, a technological marvel of Native American artisanship that the French were happy to adopt. French traders, missionaries, and officials that entered the Great Lakes necessarily learned the particulars of this canoe travel, and native-built canoes remained the standard mode of transportation throughout the French period in the Western Lakes. The French willingly embraced this system of mobility as the most functional and affordable option for traveling and transporting goods throughout the Great Lakes region. And in so doing, they followed the lead of indigenous mariners who had navigated the fresh waters of the continent in similar fashion for centuries. Chicago's portages, of course, served as a key link in this wider network of makeshift maritime travel. But despite the renewed hopes at the beginning of the 18th century that Chicago's portages would somehow fit into an expanded French maritime world, Chicago's portages never became the site of imperial power that French officials had predicted. Even with the promising geography and maritime mobility of the waterborne interior, the French struggled to harness the potential of Chicago's portages. French failures can be summed up in the renewed warfare in the form of the Fox Wars that broke out in 1712. With that, the possibility of stable French and Indigenous alliance and settlement at Chicago faltered. Violent raids starting in 1712 by and against the Meskwakis of Wisconsin, whom the French called the Renards or the Foxes, weakened French control over the western portage routes. Following the conflicts, which lasted until the 1730s, Chicago's route remained an open thoroughfare rather than imperial officials and French trade. It now became the site of illegal traders and unconquered native people. French authority failed to penetrate this elusive space. And throughout these decades of violence and uncertainty, Chicago's local geography continued to play a critical role in both French efforts at empire and alliance, but also served as a thorn in the side and what I would call a stumbling block to French control of the western Great Lakes. As we get to the 1740s, imperial priorities necessarily shifted elsewhere, and Chicago's route falls out of official French correspondence, except for the occasional complaint about clandestine traders there or residual Meskwaki populations. Chicago's waning significance to French officials is noteworthy for a site that had held so much potential early in French imperial history. From early exploration in the 1670s forward, Europeans had proven unable, in other words, to harness Chicago's portages for imperial purposes for any sustained period. French efforts at Chicago stood out as a stark failure of European colonization, and as official efforts to control Chicago's route yielded to the activities of clandestine traders, coureurs de bois, woods runners as they were called by the French, and defiant Meskwakis and Sauk's, new opportunities would arise along Lake Michigan's southwestern shoreline, but not for the French. While the French had proven incapable of exploiting Chicago's geography, the 1740s brought new and better equipped contenders to the region who would stake their fortunes on this small patch of muddy ground. In the coming decades, Potawatomis, Odawas, and Ojibways, members of the wider Anishinaabe, or Three Fires, would begin to move into Chicago's promising geography from the Great Lakes. From the late 1740s forward, they would work to consolidate their powerful position along Lake Michigan's southwestern shore. A variety of factors drew them here, including kinship ties to the Sauk and Meskwakis, the promising diversity and abundance of the wetlands ecology, but most importantly, the strategic geography along this portage route. Anishinaabe had thrived elsewhere along the water routes of the Great Lakes region for centuries, and they came well prepared to prosper in the local waterscape of Chicago. In the midst of continental upheavals elsewhere, Anishinaabe relocated to the Chicago portages in an effort to expand their influence in the western Great Lakes. Chicago's peripheral location, beyond French imperial reach, and on the fringes of Anishinaabe-Waukee, the Anishinaabe homeland, proved a valuable setting in which Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi migrants could consolidate power in the decades to come. Equipped with the environmental knowledge necessary to thrive at Chicago's transition ecosystem and endowed with the expertise of waterborne transport as a, quote, canoe people, described so by the French, these southwestern Anishinaabe carved out a sovereign space at Chicago in the years to come. Along Chicago's portages, southwestern Anishinaabe found a new geography on which to reaffirm their autonomy. From these strategic new settlements at Chicago, Milwaukee, Le Petit Fort, and down the Illinois River, Chicago Anishinaabe leaders exerted revitalized influence throughout the lower Great Lakes from about the 1750s into the 1790s. Leveraging the valuable portage route, first to maintain their distance from the French Empire, then to challenge British claims to the region in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, and ultimately, as we saw with the opening story of Siganak, to broker new deals with the Spanish allies in St. Louis and the new entity of the revolutionary American state. Here we see a map designed and in the book of what this region would have looked like as part of Anishinaabe-Waukee, the Anishinaabe homeland in the late 18th century, late 1700s. But the power exercised by the Anishinaabe of Chicago would meet a new challenge when the fledgling United States began asserting claims over the region following the Peace of Paris in 1783. During the early years after independence, U.S. officials became more interested in the western geography of the Great Lakes and Illinois country, and Chicago once again loomed large in their plans for governing the region. American officials became convinced that controlling the key geographic features like Chicago's portage was the solution to frontier stability. American statesmen like Henry Knox, George Washington, and Anthony Wayne believed they could curb the problems of Western security and state weakness along the territory's watery edges only if they controlled strategic sites of movement such as Chicago's portage. With this geographic logic, the American government made a concerted effort to bring the space and movement of Chicago's waterways under U.S. authority by securing adjacent land and building a military post there in the early years of the 1800s. But these efforts in turn would bring the U.S. into a headlong clash with local populations at Chicago, including both the Anishinaabe and resident traders who still claimed sovereignty over the area and utilized the portage to facilitate their unrestricted travel and trade between the Great Lakes and Mississippi valleys. I love these two images juxtaposed with one another. The first lithograph there you see is meant to represent an indigenous Chicago in 1820, giving this idea of a fluid frontier that is very hard to control for the Americans. The second image is John Whistler's map and plan for the building of Fort Dearborn. As you can see, very neat, very orderly, very organized. These two visions would clash at Chicago in the early 1800s, culminating, probably as many of us know, in 1812 with the murder of Jean Lalime, the Franco-American interpreter at Fort Dearborn, and then, more dramatically, with the violence of the Battle of Fort Dearborn in August of 1812. That violence that unraveled at Chicago in 1812, at its root, remained a conflict over different geographic visions for Chicago's lands and waters. U.S. officials sought to occupy Chicago's local landscape not in an effort to settle the area, but as a bid to curtail human movement and the messiness of Chicago's fluid portages. Meanwhile, local native people, European traders, and mixed-race Métis valued Chicago's fluidity as a conduit for human movement, uninhibited travel, and commercial flows. From 1790 onward, in other words, Chicago's crossroads became a flashpoint of escalating conflict as two disparate visions for the local space and wider frontier collided along this continental divide. American officials had tried to bring their vision of order to the West by fortifying the portage at Chicago in the early years of the 1800s. Their efforts had failed spectacularly in the disintegration of an orderly garrison, the outbreak of war with Great Britain, and the culminating violence of the U.S. defeat at the Battle of Fort Dearborn in 1812. But after the war, officials like Lewis Cass in Michigan, William Clark in St. Louis, and Ninian Edwards, the territorial governor of Illinois, would begin to formulate a new strategy for order in the West, one that relied less on a frontier of fortifications and military expenditures, and one that focused instead on the slightly mundane topic of internal improvements, what we might call today infrastructure. At the national level, of course, this impulse aimed to unite the country into one coherent network of transportation innovations, agricultural expansion, and commerce. But in the Great Lakes region, the fervor for infrastructure became wrapped up in the same official impulses to bring control to a disorienting borderland in which the economy still revolved around indigenous transportation systems and native power. In the years after the War of 1812, American officials would look to public works and internal improvements as the new solution to thwart the old balance of power that favored intercultural exchange and indigenous authority at sites like Chicago. It is this investment of infrastructure that ultimately reshaped Chicago into an American place and brought about the conquest and dispossession of so many of the Great Lakes indigenous peoples. I'll remind you that the U.S. government never won a military victory against the Chicago Anishinaabe. The period following the bloodshed of the War of 1812 saw no outright conflict between the incoming Americans and Chicago's Anishinaabe people. Rather, a period of government investment into internal improvements defined the renewed efforts of U.S. officials to conquer Chicago's perplexing space. Unexpectedly, this process would prove far more effective than prior attempts at colonization carried out by generations of French, British, and American predecessors. By viewing Chicago's transformation in this way, as a two-pronged conquest of both the local people and the local space, as it played out with canal projects, swamp drainages, tilling the prairie, surveys, land plots, etc. We can better understand how U.S. efforts and eventual successes in subjugating the continental interior relied on the conquest of space and geography as much as it relied on the conquest of peoples. While Chicago's geography may have proven exceptional, its history has not. The story of how Chicago went from a space of indigenous power to a conquered place within the United States offers a striking example of a process that played out repeatedly upon the continent. The relationship between the conquest of this space and the subjugation of the native people just happens to remain more traceable in a location like Chicago, where confounding waterways, a marshy ecotone, and a continental divide between watersheds complicated earlier European visions for order for centuries before the United States was able to render Chicago controllable and in turn dispossess the area's Anishinaabe of their homeland. Even before this eventual outcome, however, the control and manipulation of Chicago's space as a site of settlement, interaction, and movement played a leading role in the history of Indigenous and European relations at the portage and the wider continent. Reintegrating this human story of interaction with the spatial setting of contact offers a fuller picture of how Native peoples and Europeans coexisted and interacted across the places of early America, and also provides a clear explanation for how Euro-Americans during the era of U.S. expansion went about subduing both the peoples and places of a continent. The history of contact in North America remains then both a story of specific sites of human interaction, like Chicago's portage, and the ensuing conquest of those spaces and peoples during the rise of the United States. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Okay, let me get started here. We have quite a few coming in. Okay. Can you speak to Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable's connection to this historical landscape? And have you uncovered anything about his wife, Catherine du Sable, in your research?
Great question. So obviously, Point du Sable is a super important figure in the 18th century context of Chicago. For those of you who are not familiar, he is a free black man, a francophone free black man who most likely grew up in the Illinois country. We have baptismal records connecting him to Cahokia and other places in southern Illinois. He relocates to Chicago shortly after the American Revolution. During the American Revolution, he is kind of caught up in this cat and mouse intrigue in Lake Michigan. He had a trading post down kind of in the southern tip of Lake Michigan at that point. He's taken captive at one stage by the British. He's paroled in Detroit. He eventually ends up back in Chicago and marries into the local Potawatomi. As far as we can tell, Catherine, his wife, is related to either the Calumet towns of Potawatomi or the Chicago River proper towns. And this seems to ingratiate him into this political economy that in the 1780s and 1790s is still very much dominated by the local Anishinaabe, of which the Potawatomi are kind of the leading faction, right? So my research hasn't uncovered anything new along those lines, I don't believe. The problem with Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable is, of course, he leaves very few written records, right? We have a couple of dispensations from the Revolutionary era when different British commandants in the Great Lakes are interviewing, trying to figure out if he's an American spy or not. And then we have a few kind of more clerical records from baptisms, marriages, etc. And we have one really interesting document that outlines when he sells his trading post here at the turn of the century to, by proxy, Jean Lalime, John Kinsey, and a trader named Burnett out of St. Joseph. And so that's really all we have of him as far as written documents go. And so he's very elusive in trying to trace his history and his motivations. He doesn't write a lot down for us to know what he's up to, other than the reports of traders that travel through Chicago in the 1780s and 1790s, who all report kind of working with him here, and he basically brokers the portaging that happens between the Chicago River and the Des Plaines at that stage. He rents out, boats in some cases to people who are looking to exchange their canoes. He hires on Potawatomi porters to help carry the boats and supplies across, that sort of thing. And he's got this trading post on the north shore of the river. So that's his significance to this story.
Wonderful, thank you. And that actually kind of leads into another question about someone was curious if there was a large canoe trade on the Great Lakes and how that worked.
There was, yes. And actually, the Anishinaabe at Chicago cash in on this. And Anishinaabe people across the Great Lakes make a lot of money or capital off of the canoe trade, because French and then later British and Americans were not confident canoe builders at this stage. They rely on native canoe builders to supply the boats. So Mackinac, up at the very tip of the lower peninsula of Michigan, is a canoe depot where Odawas and other Anishinaabe are selling recently built canoes to passing parties of traders, right? If your leaky canoe from Montreal is in need of repair or replacement by the time you get to Mackinac, the Odawa are happy to charge you very high prices to give you a new canoe there. And the same seems to be true at Chicago to a lesser extent. The problem with Chicago is that it's on the very southern tip of the paper birch range, so there's not a whole lot of birch accessible locally. But this seems to be the carryover point where people would exchange their birch bark canoes, which were great for traveling in the Great Lakes, for the heavier duty pirogues or dugout canoes. And this seems to be the exchange point based on the records that we have of these traders. If they get as far south as Chicago, here, let's say in 1790, they might sell their birch bark canoe to Jean-Baptiste Point de Sable in exchange for a dugout pirogue that they can then take into the Des Plaines, Illinois, and Mississippi rivers, where you don't have a steady supply of paper birch to repair your craft. So that is absolutely an industry that is happening in the Great Lakes at this time, and it makes Chicago a commercial center for these Anishinaabe who can kind of make money off of selling these canoes to passing traders. They also make a whole lot of they garner a whole lot of goods, I should say, out of selling foodstuffs to the passing traders who are relying on corn and hunted meat from indigenous sellers to supply their travels in this region.
Great, thank you. Okay, I think we have a couple of questions touching on this, and this might be our last one. I don't want to go over here, but we have some questions about other scholarship that deal about like 18th century power struggles in the area. Someone specifically asking if you know of any other books about the Beaver or Fox Wars.
Yes, so there's a couple obvious ones. The Middle Ground is still an excellent book for making sense of this wider region's kind of interactions between Native people and Europeans. That's by Richard White. It's slightly older now, but it's kind of the go-to foundational text. A recent book that is excellent on the Fox Wars is Robert Morrissey's People of the Ecotone, which came out. He's at the University of Illinois. This book came out just last year, and it really kind of grounds the explanation for the Fox Wars, which played out in the early 1700s in this region, in kind of the environmental conditions of the tallgrass prairie. And it makes sense of this as kind of indigenous conflict between the Meskwaki, right, the Fox, and the Illinois Confederacy as much as it's about the French Empire in the region. So those are two books that I definitely point to. Another one that is helpful for the Great Lakes and especially the Anishinaabe side of it is called Masters of Empire. It's about the Odawa of the Mackinac region, but it kind of has these wider connotations as well.
Thank you. Okay, I think we will end it there.
Okay, thank you
Thank
all
you
for
so
having
much.
me.